So it seems that the Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes have got some pretty significant points cuts to some key units, but is it going to be enough to turn their fortunes around? Let's talk through the Space Marine buffs and what it means for the units affected. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more. I thought I'd do a focus video on the core Codex Space Marines, talking through each of the units that had points changes in the big Warhammer 40k updates that dropped earlier today. Broadly speaking, I think it's nudged the faction in the right direction, but maybe not by quite as much as some people might have hoped. Prior to the updates, the core Codex Space Marines were struggling, the faction sitting on around about 42% win rates at big tournaments, the lowest in Warhammer 40k alongside Deathwatch. It was kind of predictable that the core Codex Space Marines would be doing kind of badly. They only had borderline low win rates before at 45% or so, and then they had a whole load of their key units nerfed, things like Aggressors, Inceptors, the Redemptor Dreadnought, and a few others. Space Marines do have that ongoing balance issue that Games Workshop can't really fix with points very easily. Their main problem is that the Divergent chapters basically can do Space Marines but better. They can use literally everything that the core codex can use, but then also get extra detachment access and extra unit access. The large amount of choices they have usually means they've got at least something that is worth taking over the core codex, so are likely to be directly stronger. To rectify that, you'd actually have to make the core codex characters perhaps significantly undercosted to tempt people to play the main chapters, or give them some sort of core rules boost, like say maybe a very slightly stronger Oath of Moment or similar. If you happen to play core Codex Space Marines versus the Divergent chapters, if any of that happens though, it'll be for another time. Maybe Games Workshop might try and do something ambitious when we do the next balanced data slate in summer. This time though, they did help out a whole bunch of generic datasheets. I thought I'd take a look at all the units from the core Codex Space Marines, how much they went down and what percentage they changed by, and talk about where they were before versus where they're likely to be now. I'm not going to go over all the Divergent chapters in this video, I did talk through them a little bit in the last video, so feel free to check that one out after, I'll leave that linked down in the video description. Before starting, I thought I'd just quickly mention the discount retailers that are linked down in the video description. One way to support Auspex Tactics in these videos is to use the independent wargaming shops that are linked down in the video description for Warhammer purchases if you choose to make some. It can be a good way to save a bit of money versus Games Workshop's Warhammer web store, usually in the region of 10 to 20%, and if you did happen to buy anything through them, then it does help support Auspex Tactics a little bit as well, so feel free to check them out in your own area. There's Element Games in the UK, Gap Games in Australia, Fenris Workshop in Canada, and Wargame Portal in the USA. A big thank you to any of you folks choosing to use those, it is a big factor in keeping these videos coming. Let's get into points changes though, and first up Games Workshop have shown a bit of love to the Firstborn Space Marines. The Tactical Squad felt like one of the most overcosted units for what it did in the Codex, and Games Workshop have given the standard issue Firstborn Squad a big points cut, dropping down from 160 to 140 points. 14 points per power armoured body really isn't too bad, though you do still have to buy them in squads of 10, which is kind of a weakness. Percentage decrease wise, these guys are the biggest winners out of the update, dropping down a big 13%, and that is quite a meaningful amount. Despite that though, they were extremely underwhelming before for the points cost, basically no real reason to take them over things like Intercessors or Assault Intercessors, and I must admit the core rules of the datasheet almost feel like they work against you a bit rather than for you. Usually I think you'd want to be splitting them in half, maybe having the dangerous weapons like the special weapons, sergeant, and perhaps even the heavy weapon go up the board to skirmish with the enemy, and then sit the bolters on the home field objective perhaps, just to be some cheap tough bodies with OC2. That doesn't seem like the worst deal in the world for essentially 70 points per each 5-man squad. If you want budget power armor bodies, these seem to be the way to go now, though I still feel like they're going to face stiff competition from all the other power armor variants that you can take. Intercessors with their objective secured special rule, Assault Intercessors with also being cheap bodies and some good melee threat, plus the cheaper scouts or the deep strike denying infiltrators. I definitely feel that post update though, if you did want to make tactical squads work, they are far more doable than they were before, so quite a good points change overall. I'm not sure if they're going to be massively game changing top tier for Space Marines or anything though. Next up we've got the Brutalis Dreadnought, which also got a fairly appreciable points cut. He dropped down from 175 to 160, a big 9% decrease there. Previously out of the 3 Redemptor chassis, he was probably the weakest of them, competing with the -1 damage and fairly good shooting output of the Redemptor, or the cheap tough gun turret that is the Ballistus. As ever with these guys, they feel like they were sort of big win or big loss units. If you make combat with something important, then they're really good. If you don't, then they could be a bit of a point sink for no real gain. I think 160 points really gets it into a much better place though. It's a pretty tanky Danger Dreadnought that can do pretty well with Armour of Contempt. The twin multi-melters can genuinely be a threat to tanks, and then when it gets into close combat it should shred things pretty well, either with the claws or talons. Might be particularly nice in some detachments that have some kind of combo of advanced shooting and charge. Anything that allows you to advance and deal damage with these guys would be good. Maybe Gladius is quite a good home for them. In any case, seems quite solid. I feel like you might get people considering them as maybe a budget option versus a Redemptor now. Next up, we've got a smallish points cut for the Terminators, dropping down from 185 to 175. I feel like Terminators being buffed were quite a good unit to choose really. Kind of the poster boys of 40k 10th edition with really cool new models, and in theory supposed to be the fighting elite of the Space Marines, but very rarely played in competitive games. Their defense is okay, but their damage a bit underwhelming, and they just added up to being pretty usable casually, but just kind of underwhelming, and not really very standout versus the many competitors they have for the points cost. Dropping down to 175 is only a 5% decrease, so it's not like it's enormous. I'm not sure it's going to be quite enough to flip them to being outright strong, but definitely has them ascending in the Space Marine power rankings a little bit. I'd likely be tempted by the Power Fists and the Cyclone Missile Launcher. They are a unit that you could maybe consider any detachment-specific enhancements or stratagems to focus around them, as they're really quite a big investment unit. I've seen some people infiltrate them in Vanguard. Otherwise, kind of a similar story in my opinion for the Terminator Assault Squad. They drop down from 195 to 185. I typically want to use the Thunderhammers and the Storm Shields for big tanky 4-wound Terminators, with a little bit of devastating wound threat in melee. They're perhaps a unit that's a bit more tempting in Black Templars versus some other ones. They can flex into Anti-Psycho for a command point, and that can be pretty brutal on a 4+ with the devastating wounds from those hammers. Plus the 6+ Feel No Pain from Righteous Crusaders doesn't do them any harm either. I'd say perhaps one of the biggest winners from these changes are the Jump Pack Intercessors. They drop down from 85 points to 80 points, just 16 points per model for a Jump Pack Space Marine with a heavy bolt pistol and an Astartes chainsword, never mind the mortal wound impact hits, plasma pistols and power fist in the unit. Even at 85 points they were being run competitively from time to time. Quite nice cheap units that are good for jumping around to do secondaries or deep striking in to do them, and then still having some good melee threat against the enemy. The chainswords are pretty brutal against light infantry, and when you add in the fancy pistols, fist and the mortal wounds, they can actually do a bit of damage to heavy stuff. They're pretty standout grades in Blood Angel Sons of Sanguinius with the extra strength and attacks and things, and Kavan Shrike makes them nice in Raven Guard too. Dropping down to 80 points just makes them stand out even further. Seems like they'll see similar sort of play in the Blood Angels, maybe alongside Jump Sanguinary Priests where they sort of counteract the points increase that he got. And it is just kind of weird to see Jump Infantry costing the exact same as the on-foot version like regular Intercessors. I would expect these guys to be pretty competitive for at least the next few months or so. I kind of wonder if Games Workshop wanted to sell a few more Jump Pack boys. I might actually have to get round to putting together that Space Marine Spearhead force that I got. Feels like it's going to be good news for anyone who picked that up. There are a few left in Element Games, which is linked in the video description if you did want a few of these guys at a discount. Bear in mind though that given that this is Games Workshop and Warhammer, these guys could be utterly terrible in the next balance update for all we know. Next up, the Hellblasters got a really big boost. They dropped down from 125 points to 115 points per 5 of them, a big 8% drop there. And again, I feel like, as with the Jump Intercessors, they were really quite usable before. They certainly tended to crop up more in casual lists versus competitive ones, but they were genuinely quite a good danger unit there. Really quite easy to use with general purpose firepower, and you get the reward for them being shot down in death, which is quite a good consolation prize. A bit of damage in the enemy turn can be kind of big to take out their damage dealers before they get to shoot or charge. I was thinking that these guys weren't really all that far from being very good, and I suspect that a 10 points decrease might tip the balance on that. They certainly seem interesting for the Gladius Fire Discipline combo now. 10 Hellblasters now cost less than 6 Aggressors, and getting higher AP on all those attacks isn't the worst thing in the world either. Plus they could be particularly interesting for Dark Angels with Azrael. Pretty much auto-include as a character and gives out some massive unit buffs, given that these guys are now looking not quite as much more compared with company heroes for a fairly serious damage dealer, might be of interest there as well. Might not be the most useful thing for getting points of Space Marine on the board though, as they were one of the best points per money that Space Marine had, That's still the case, though a little bit less than before with the points decrease obviously, but overall seems like pretty good news for the fun plasma guys. Next up, we've got the Incursors that dropped down from 85 points to 80. I feel like previously they were a unit that you might have perhaps one of in gunline armies, just literally to hand out their +1 to hit special rule. It's quite nice that you could potentially mark one target with Oath of Moment and then another target with +1 to hit, so you can really get some pretty accurate shooting on two different things. Perhaps beyond that though, when you really start to get into diminishing returns, I feel like they're just not really a unit that you'd want to spam. Otherwise, just having some marine bodies with scouts is handy enough, plus the haywire mine if the enemy does charge them could be big enough against vehicles, I guess. An extra 5-point cut definitely helps them compete a bit better against all the other Space Marine troops out there, of which there are lots. You're still going to have to weigh them up against things like Intercessors with their marked objectives, Infiltrators with their deep strike denial, and Scouts for their cheapness and objective things. For a fairly heavy Space Marine gunline army though, they don't look all that bad. Finally, for the unit buffs, we've got the Vindicator, which dropped down to 175 points from 190. I feel like this points decrease was quite a nice one. It was generally considered pretty fine in Ironstorm Spearhead before. For some reason it got fashionable to spam them for a little bit, then people stopped doing it quite so much. Either way though, it's shortish range for pretty solid anti-tank, and it gets on incredibly well with the Ironstorm Spearhead stratagems, things like returning fire, or the big Mercier's weakness one, where it certainly has enough threats to warrant that one. Dropping down to 175 is a really big boost to it. It was maybe a bit of a big investment one before, that if the enemy targeted it with serious anti-tank could be kind of painful to lose early. I have a suspicion that Ironstorm Spearhead lists will be a lot more tempted by this guy now, and it's usable enough in other detachments, even if there it might feel a bit less standout versus the other damage dealers you could use. I have a suspicion though that it's really going to be the Chaos Vindicator that's tearing it up in terms of damage output after the update. That thing getting dark packs is absolutely massive. I might have to talk about that in the next video. That's the good stuff, but there were a few nerfs. The Eliminators one, I'm not sure what they were going for. A 75-point unit that went up to 85. They were playable enough, but kind of overshadowed by Scouts or Infiltrators for most competitive lists. Really not a unit that needed to go up in points whatsoever in my opinion, and seemed to be costed pretty fairly to me. I do wonder whether or not this is due to that slightly dumb trick that you can do with the firing deck on the Impulsor. If you get an Instigator carbine, you can potentially jump out of the Impulsor, fire your guns, jump back in the Impulsor with the Instigator move, and then fire again out of the firing deck technically. For some reason that does check out rules as written, even if it's not intended. But even with that slightly janky double shooting, it didn't really actually amount to it being all that overpowered. That was 230 points worth of models just to get 8 last fusel shots plus whatever the Impulsor can do. And it all relied on an 80-point transport not being popped or the Eliminators not getting overwatched. So while it was kind of fun and silly, it wasn't really something that I thought needed any sort of points addressing really, maybe just tightening up the rules on the firing deck somehow. In any case, I feel like this is a pretty serious points nerf. It went from fairly good but overshadowed to just fairly underwhelming. I'd be far more tempted to take either Scouts or Infiltrators now, and probably would have before. Next up, we have the poor Storm Raven, daring to be good in one competitive army list build in the Ironstorm Spearhead. This thing went up from 240 to 260 points, so an 8% increase there. After being kind of neglected in the early edition, and even after the Space Marine Codex came out, people seemed to discover that it could do well in Ironstorm Spearhead, particularly with Dark Angels. It's a big scary vehicle that can make good use of stratagems, and you use Armour of Contempt and its -1 damage rule to survive the counter-attack. In particular, it tended to be pretty good with the Landspeeder Dark Shroud for Dark Angels. That could also give it cover out in the open and -1 to hit, so you did have one hard to take down Space Marine flyer that had a whole load of guns. Definitely kind of problematic when you've also got a Redemptor jumping out at the same time and doing the same sort of thing. It does seem that Games Workshop just generally have their unofficial policy of flyers must not be competitive. Whenever they regularly get tournament play, it seems like they get nerfed, even if it happens just to be in one particular combo. I don't really think that either the Storm Raven nor the Dark Shroud is really all that exciting alone, and even combining the two in the Ironstorm Spearhead, I'm still not sure if it's actually massively overpowered as opposed to just fairly strong and acceptable. In any case though, the Storm Raven's a bit worse than it was before, probably still not awful if you're comboing it with the Dark Shroud in that Ironstorm Spearhead, but outside of that it certainly got into a far more underwhelming unit and wasn't starting from the best place in the world. Finally, there were nerfs to 2 Ironstorm enhancements, the Master of the Machine War to allow you to shoot while falling back or advancing, quite a big tool in supporting vehicle armies moving forward and meaning that you can be more aggressive with them and not having to be worried about being tapped in combat making you have tricky decisions. It could be used by things like the Combi Weapon Lieutenant and the Third Boss Librarian. I still think it's usable, but certainly paying more for it. Otherwise, the Adept of the Omnissiah is the one where you can change an inflicted damage result to 0. That one went up to 35 points from 25. Still worth having, I think. If you just cancel out something like a las cannon shot, you could easily still pay itself off in just one single attack deflected. Well worth having on a Tech Marine, even at that cost. Despite the increase, I still feel like both of those have a good chance of getting used. Might be just a little bit more take or leave than they were, and I suppose for the Ironstorm Spearhead in particular, those cheaper Vindicators might compensate a bit. I guess for Black Templar specific Ironstorm Spearhead, the nerfs to the Black Templars might have chipped in a bit. The multi-melters on the vehicles going up in cost will hurt that a tiny bit, but not as relevant if you weren't running your Marines as Black Templars for that. Otherwise though, with so many datasheets in Codex Space Marines, even adjusting the points cost on like 10 of them isn't going to make that big a difference. There still feels like there's a lot of datasheets that either got missed or neglected in this, maybe Reavers being the single most prominent example. I feel like the spooky scary Primaris with skull masks basically have been and always will be so optimal. They're still paying 5 points more than a whole bunch of their power armoured counterparts right now. Otherwise, the Fire Strike servo turret perhaps feels like it could use another 5-point decrease. The Hammerfort bunker as a fortification remains hugely overcosted, and for heavy weapon Space Marines, both the Devastators and the Desolation squads feel like you're paying more for their cost versus the other options that you could get for fire support. Hellblasters or Eradicators or big gun tanks just do their job better. Not sure I'm overly hopeful for Desolation squads ever getting any sort of love, given that they do indirect fire kind of things, and again Games Workshop seems to want to keep them niche. Overall, I feel like it's broadly a step in the right direction, certainly helps some internal codex balance for a bunch of units, but I'm not sure it's going to revolutionise Space Marine win rates or anything like that, and I still feel like they're directly outcompeted by the various Divergent chapter units that are out there. Though as mentioned, I feel like some sort of rules change really would be needed if you're going to make that work a bit better. I'd say that quite a few of the buffs here tend to fall on units that were sort of mid to bad before, and more get them into being usable as opposed to top tier for Space Marines, which to be fair isn't the worst for internal faction balance, and definitely helps them out for more casual lists that you happen to use those units. I'd say perhaps for competitive play the most interesting stuff are the cheaper Vindicators for Ironstorm Spearhead. They were already fine, and they got a pretty good points decrease. 80-point jump Intercessors now look like they're seriously competitive with the other Space Marine move around and score type options. Their damage output isn't even all that bad at all. And Hellblasters I feel like might have tipped the balance from mid to pretty good. Can't help but think that we might see a few more people playing with them. They were certainly played in great numbers casually. They even managed to make the top 10 in most feared Warhammer 40k units out there, so I'm sure the opponents of Space Marine players in the more casual meta are going to be seeing a lot more of these guys out there. In any case though, let me know your thoughts on the Space Marine changes. Look forward to hearing your ideas down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'll certainly be aiming to do a similar video to this for a few more factions. Finally, if you'd like to support the videos and help keep these coming, as well as the discount links in the video description, there's also the channel's Patreon page, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.